Great, thanks, Mike. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to Parandis Abdi's Milestone 4 thesis presentation. Her thesis is entitled Line in Architecture, Inhabiting Drawing. Parandis's committee consists of her supervisor, John Circa, her second reader, Colin Ripley, and myself as program rep. And we have two external guests with us today for this final review. Chloe Town joins us from the University of Toronto, where she is an assistant professor at the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design. And Stefano Corbo joins us from the Rhode Island School of Design, where he is graduate program director for architecture. Thank you both so much for joining us this morning. So the way this morning will unfold is Parandis, you will present for approximately 20 minutes. I will keep time, but I will not interrupt you unless you really start to look like you're going to go way over. Once Parandis has completed her presentation, we will invite our guests to start the discussion with questions and comments on the work, and then we will expand that to the committee. Once that has been completed, we will ask Parandis to please leave the meeting so that the committee can deliberate in private, and then Parandis, John will get back to you with a debrief of that discussion. So we have a generous time frame for all of this, so we can have a robust discussion. And I believe, Stefano, I think you said you have to leave us at 10:45. Is that correct? Okay, so that's still a good time frame. So having said all that, we're ready for you, Parandis. So whenever you're ready, I see your screen's already shared, so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marco. As Marco mentioned, my title is Line in Architecture, Inhabiting Drawing. I will remove my video for the sake of the presentation, and I'll bring it back up once I'm done. Architecture is a set of ideas, and drawings are the medium in which those ideas are explored and presented. Through drawings, ideas evolve beyond their representational capacity. Though the line exists prior to architecture, architecture is dependent on the line. The line in architecture is often seen only as what is drawn, masking its complexity. This presentation starts by looking at the complexity of the line in architecture to understand its fundamental qualities. Secondly, drawing in architecture is explored through a personal design process in the form of the writer's house. The presentation concludes with a call to inhabit drawing. Inhabiting is not only a physical phenomenon, as inhabitation occurs beyond a building. In order to inhabit architecture, drawings are to be seen as more than just drawn lines. In order to inhabit drawing, the line in architecture needs to be seen as an encapsulation of the drawing, thinking, and writing of architecture. In drawing, there's a direct relationship with the drawn line. In thought, there's a direct relationship with the line of thought. In text, there's a direct relationship with the line of text. Drawing in architecture is a medium used for ideas to emerge. Therefore, every drawing uses all three of these forms of line. The drawing within architecture includes working drawings and also the models and sketches which precede contract documents. As Peter Eisenman says, with drawings, I'm not trying to represent something. I'm trying to make it real. Therefore, the real architecture only exists in the drawings. The real building exists outside the drawing, end quote. Drawing is not a representation of a building, nor is it a placeholder for a building. Architectural drawings have the ability to create an experience unlike being physically in a building. Through John Haydock's drawing of Wallhouse 2, he manages to match the convention of the flat surface of drawing to the plan's building, while trying to revive the meaning of abstract spatial signals. The drawing thereby enforces in the imagination spatial perceptions, which ironically can't be controlled in the actual experience of architecture. In architecture, the process of creation is neither entirely flat nor three-dimensional. It is a mixture. The drawn line is formulated through thinking and writing. The drawn line is an extension of the body into the actual drawing. This line gives material to drawing using expression and meaning. The drawn line in architecture is a general term to indicate representation. The famous statement, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, by René Descartes, indicates the primacy of thought. He further claims imagination, feeling, and memories are part of thought. Our thoughts are in reference to the world around us, but create a repertoire in between themselves. In the myth of Theseus, Daedalus designed the labyrinth. Contrary to common belief, Beatrice Colomina states that this does not make Daedalus the architect. The person who uncovers the secrets of the labyrinth is Ariadne, who offered the threat to Theseus to allow him to escape the labyrinth. The act of solving the labyrinth through the device of a ball of thread demonstrates the use of thought to understand the form of the labyrinth. Using thinking as a way to uncover the architecture, Ariadne is deemed the first architect. The thought itself is a trigger for the formulation of the line of thought. This conceptual device of the thread is an actualized line of thought. The idealization of the straight geometrical line, which represents the physical labyrinth, is proven not to leave a burden on architectural thinking. The line of thought is not linear. The line of thought is a line of variety, line of least resistance with no distinct organization behind it. As Catherine Ingram puts it, it is comparable to Le Corbusier's donkey line of urbanism. There's no start and end to the line of thought as it picks up from a point on the line is processed. As Eisenman states, drawing is a way of thinking. So to me, drawing is a form of writing and a form of reading what I write, end quote. Architectural texts generate meaning in conversation with a reader. Jacques Derrida brings up the idea that the sign and the signified, the word and its meaning, can be split. Eisenman explores this split in his House 6, where the architect becomes the manipulator of these meanings. Therefore, has the open frame to shape the viewer's understanding of them, shaping their interpretations. Architectural text is what allows the viewer to read drawings and give meaning to the drawn line represented. Therefore, the line of text is the line which allows the reader to interpret the thought of the drawn line, the line of discourse. The line in architecture is defined in this thesis as the complex line of process. The three lines spoken about are not representable lines. Therefore, for the sake of their exploration within this thesis, they're explored through the effect on drawing. The drawn line is explored through drawing, the line of thought is explored through geometry, and the line of text through image. Further, these qualities are then explored through the use of characters, as in a narrative. From this point forward, these characters will be used to narrate the line as process. The characters are named substance, consciousness, and the spectral, which are derived from the three qualities examined within drawing. The literary device of personification is used to expose the characteristics of ordinary things in and outside of architecture, to expose their complexity. John Haydick uses characters in a similar way, where for him, developing characters in his architecture is similar to creating worlds. The assembly and recombination of three houses related to the three characters is explored through the writer's house. I am assembling this writer in particular, and as such, it is directly influenced by my process. The writer embodies an architect, an entity which creates architecture while considering a reader. The writer's house is a metaphor for drawing in architecture and the medium of exploration for the lineless process. Through this design process, eventually the reader's perspective is shaped to inhabit drawing, inhabiting the process of architecture. In this thesis, the writer writes three different houses to write her own house. She does not think in words, images, nor drawings, instead writes in drawings. The reader, however, reads the writer's house to write their own house. The reader reorders the house in order to inhabit it, each time differently, thinks, reads, and draws. The characters start as a series of drawings which develop in accordance with descriptions and associated paintings and models to reveal three houses, one for each character. The house for the concept of substance is called the routine house. The house for consciousness is the relative house, and the house for the spectral is the haunted house. As each house reflects the ideas and qualities of the character, a communication between the three characters and their houses interact and an open dialogue as the writer's house. The first character set of ideas we will look at is the character of substance, who builds on material in architecture. This form of material is purely used for the process of thinking rather than referring to a specific material quality. Ideas manifest themselves in many ways, on paper, on screen, in a model, or through building. These materials exercise thought. In a way, material and the drawn line mold each other. This character's view of the world is entirely made of material. It includes the physicality of the body and all its internal connections to itself, and purely to other physical objects. Substance is materialized in the routine house, a house mainly concerned with the material of exploration and its internal self. A house consists of qualities which make it physical, the texture, the materials, and other qualities which make it corporeal. The routine house embraces these qualities. The routine house on its own can be seen from different vantage points. The house is seen as a three-dimensional object rotating to reveal all its facets. These views are then up to the writer to select and decide on the point of entry for the reader. The house develops through its interaction with the other houses. The routine house, although it is seen differently than the other houses, combines with the relative and haunted house to make this interaction tangible. Back to its original state, the house can be seen as a building sheltering the body, a place to rest, a place to renew. Then again, the same house, in reference to the rest of the houses and their characters, questions these spaces for the body. This house is attached to the drawn line while referencing the line of thought. The next house is the relative house. The relative house is related to the character of consciousness. The same set of views now turn the house into an object of depiction. The relation of each drawn line to another makes for infinite spatial opportunities, but made possible only through its reference to the other two forms of line. The relative house combines complex geometry and creates varied forms, negotiating a tactic behind their intersections. As discussed by Robert MacArthur and Juhani Pallasmaa, without the occupant's conscious knowledge, the house organizes and guides his or her acts, perceptions, memories, thoughts, and dreams. The relative house is a conscious organization of the substance's acts within the routine house. It is a house which constantly references itself and makes sense of its relationships, therefore communicates with the routine and haunted houses. The spaces which were once physical in the routine house to shelter the body no longer exist, but only retain their geometry. While trying to communicate with the rest of the houses, the relative house alters the way it is represented to the reader. This house reveals the line of thought while relying on the line of text to be understood in relation to the drawn line. The character of consciousness's view of the world is made entirely of geometry. Geometry exists in all drawings, creating a point of reference. As Robin Evans states, architects do not produce geometry, they consume it. Geometry's referential ability creates a repertoire of knowledge, like memories do within thought. Geometry is the method of thinking represented architecturally within drawing. Geometry is retrieved by referencing imagination and consciousness. The next and last character, which helps the other characters convey their essential qualities, is the spectral. The character of the spectral communicates through images within architecture. Images are concepts which reveal the meaning of what is being represented. Images consist of text. In fact, they exist because of meaning, as they are a form of knowledge which depends on translation. As noted by Evans, together with numbers and words, images help objectify what each private consciousness could never otherwise convey, end quote. Just like numbers and words, images are the text of translation between drawings and consciousness. The spectral character has the widest range of information which the other characters can borrow from, to help them move within their internal, as in for substance, or referential, as in for consciousness' cycles. The spectral appears in the haunted house. This house reveals the line of text while making a close connection to the line of thought and the different perceptions of the drawn line. The haunted house is made up of frames. The lack of surfaces make it impossible to enter physically. Each space is fleeting, once a form, now a shadow. Because of the house's spectral qualities, it is no longer assumed to be an object rotating, but rather questions its three-dimensionality. It is the emergence of the repressed, veiled, and shadowed. Even when the house communicates with the rest of the other two houses, it is like a skeleton which braces the empty shadows and the physical surfaces, questioning every drawn line. The house on its own fights to emerge, but lacks rationality and substance. Here it relies on the other components. Once merged with the rest of the houses, the haunted house establishes physicality in wireframe to non-physically formed spaces. There is a portion in the design process which is invisible, and this invisible process exists in every drawing. The writer's house hints at the development of its process through the use of characters and allows for the fabrication to happen in the mind, allowing the reader to inhabit the house and approach the invisible process. The combination of the three houses results in a three-dimensional house from which the writer's house emerges. The writer's house is a physical section cut through this accumulated house. This one orthographic, the section, allows the writer to read the connections the three characters make. The section allows for the writer's house to reveal what happens in a drawing, what the drawn lines hide to reveal the line of thought and visualize the possibilities of the line of text. The image quality is symbolized through its black and white contrast, the apparent shadows. The shadow of the writer's house acts as a conceptual axis to allow for the merging of the dimensions, the connections, and the conversations which happen between the characters. A set of drawings start to shape the writer's house from the isometric seen before. Shadows in the writer's house extend within the drawing as an axis. The axis of shadows flatten the house by withdrawing from the three-dimensional quality of represented space. As further clarified by Gaston Bachelard in the Poetics of Space, a house constitutes a body of images that give mankind proofs or illusions of stability, end quote. This unifies the house in its complexity despite its instability. In the case of the writer's house, the house is a combination of physical material, organized thoughts, and a body of images. All of these qualities together oscillate between material stability and the illusion of stability of the drawings, promoting inhabitation. The drawing thrives on instability. The series of drawings end as the reader tries to connect the drawings of the writer's house, slowly starting a journey, a line of text to precipitate the reader's house. The reader's house merges the drawings. This house tries to understand the entirety of the design process, resulting in a complex drawing for the reader. The line as process highlights the architectural conversation from thought to drawings and text, making architecture the intersection of clashing ideas with an unlimited number of representations to evolve. The writer's house is written as the construction of lines of thought and the translation to drawn lines. The reader's house is read as a translation of lines of text from drawn lines to construct new lines of thought. The reader reads the dialogue between substance, consciousness, and the spectral, or between the physical, representational, and conceptual through the writer's house. Inhabitation is built upon the idea of dwelling. In a book on Theodor Adorno, Matthew Wagner speaks of dwelling as more than just a spatial experience. We dwell in houses, neighborhoods, and cities, but we also dwell in things like writing and text, among neighbors and strangers, and amid sensorial relations to pastness, presentness, and futurity, end quote. Dwelling and inhabitation are the most fundamental and subtle tasks of architecture experienced in everyday life. As stated by Bachelard, inhabited space transcends geometrical space. The inhabitation of the space of architecture extends beyond its geometry. Bachelard also speaks of images inhabiting. A living creature fills an empty refuge. Images inhabit, and all corners are haunted, if not inhabited. The 6th Street house drawing by Tom Main and Andrew Zago is inhabited just as the Puerto de Europa sketch by Philip Johnson is inhabited. in spite of different levels of complexity. The ideas which occupy these drawn lines let the architecture emerge. The line of text gives the reader the ability to distinguish forms and associate meaning with the drawing in order to read the architect's line of thought. Simple drawings and the graphics can also capture complex ideas. We will hear John Haydick in the next slide speak of this inhabitation.
I remember Dr. Eisenman coming to Berlin and seeing these two pieces of in this great hall. They were 50 foot high, and people didn't come into the hall because of the kind of presence. They were giving off something, right? We talked about an aura, a thing like that. And he says to me that they're not architecture because you can't get in them. And I looked at him and I said, you can't get in them. See? In other words, he was not in the position to get into them because he did not understand them.
Architecture offers its inhabitants the ability to enter without simply being an outside spectator. As Haydick says, we become part of its very interior organism. We become physical, organic participators. We become enclosed. Looking at a drawing gives the viewer the ability to pass the threshold of the flat drawing plane and become part of its world while being conscious of its context synchronously. Architecture allows for this atmospheric inhabitation. The viewer of an architectural drawing has the ability to enter through the lineless process and inhabit the drawing while simultaneously merging with the architecture. Through all this, I was producing a set of drawings to inhabit through the complex lines of architecture. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Parandis. 6 seconds to spare, well done. I'm going to invite our external guests to start with any questions they might have for clarification or to jump right into commentary. So Chloe and Stefano, whenever you're ready.
Okay, I have just a couple of questions before jumping into comments, and reflections about your, thoughtful presentation. First of all, I have a general question, about consciousness, and I would like, and I would love to hear from you and to elaborate a bit more on how exactly consciousness can refer to this idea of geometry, just to expand a bit more on what you said and what you wrote in your book. And then I have another question, a very technical question about those beautiful drawings that you presented today and that you have in your booklet. I get the purple lines from your, cutting process and your process of sectioning. I didn't quite well understand the green lines, what those green lines stand for in terms of process.
Okay, so I'll start with the last question. I'll go back to the first one. So the reason that there is the contrast of qualities between the black and white, which I explained, where the spectral and the image quality comes in, the same thing happens once the cut happens prior to the spectral trying to interact with the house. Once the spectral tries to interact, it contrasts everything that is already there. So the reason that there's a contrast in color with the pink is that there's a green is because of the spectral quality, which is trying to fight with everything that's represented. So if that answers your question.
Yes.
That's why I only use 2 colors. So there was one color that cut the building, and then there was another which tries to fight, and that comes on through the reader's house in those drawings. And your first question, so in terms of consciousness, there's an unknown quality to consciousness. And the way I thought about consciousness was that we always have like a bank of things that we always think of, our memories, and we refer back to those as we are as we were looking at a drawing. So geometry does the same in terms of it architecturally. If you're looking at a drawing that consists of only geometry, you're trying to relate it back to geometry that you've seen before or that you've physically experienced, and that creates that same kind of reference back and forth. And that was the referential quality of geometry, which also connects with the referential quality of consciousness.
Okay, thank you.
You know, my comments are actually kind of similar as Stefano's, kind of this construct of consciousness and geometry, because to one extent, I might feel differently in vis-a-vis your thesis, Parandis, which, by the way, is spectacular. The drawings are exquisite, and the way that you presented was just extraordinary. So I want to just I want to lead by that so that it doesn't seem like, you know, the conversation is just cutting to the chase. It's because it's so strong that you provoked in me a lot of questions, which is precisely what a good thesis does. I'm not sure about by the way, I like that you divide your house and your process very clearly into sort of the three conditions, the relative, all of that really works well. But when I read the thesis and I was trying to figure out your architectural references, the ones that were strongest, to me at least, were kind of the Eisenman-Hedek camp, despite their argument perhaps about you can't enter the drawing. And then those that are more, I would say, like the Zumthors, those that really take on materiality. It's when we put Eisenman in the camp of geometry, right, that things get a little bit tricky for me, because my feeling is that when he says things like, I'm interested in floating signifiers, or, you know, his attempts to make it real, I think, in fact, his reading of Deleuze or of, you know, architecture as somehow a language is precisely the opposite of consciousness in some ways. So, for example, I would say that he might have learned from Hedek, but my understanding, having had him as a studio professor, is that he's completely indifferent to the occupant, to the, you know, for example, the question that you asked in that second set of drawings, where do you enter? He doesn't care about that. And to me, it's not to quibble about the drawings themselves, but just to kind of point out that, to Stefano's point, that the equivalent, it might be a false equivalency, geometry to consciousness. It's not so much a question as my own sort of takeaway.
No, I completely understand where you're coming from, because the reason I picked consciousness is not necessarily in a physical way where so the word consciousness to me was a word to use in terms of reference. That's why I called them characters. So you don't become too, you don't go into the definition of consciousness. It's not about you walking and realizing materials or anything that has to do with that. It was about the geometry of drawings and the drawn line. And also where you said that Eisenman, and I tried to change the connection between Eisenman and geometry into Eisenman and text, because in my presentation, I tried to make that connection where the line of text is what Eisenman was concerned with. So the line of like meaning in his drawings and splitting the signifier and signifier. So that's why, to me, maybe the image quality or the text of the drawing comes out more through Eisenman's work. And so the split there is that consciousness wasn't, it's a word I used to, as a character to expand on geometry, but not necessarily bound to the meaning of consciousness as being conscious of things around us in physical way. So it's not about the inhabitant, it's about looking and being.
I think that's fair. There is something quite concrete and specific about geometry, I suppose, in architectural drawings. You know, as you say, the call to questioning the line. And maybe this is a spring point to say that I really liked your first set of drawings. I like them a lot, that they have this kind of suggestion of the body. They have suggestion of kind of the phantasmagoric. They're almost incantatory, you know, they seem kind of celebratory, and it's precisely because they stray from the architectural tradition that we've seen in the 20th century, right? Sort of El Lissitzky to Eisenman, Hedek, Tom Main, as you say, those kind of heavily constructed geometrical drawings. And you point to something that I think is new. It's indebted to maybe Photoshop, you know, new ways of representing things. It's precisely in its departure where you, Parandis, have done something that is unlike your, you know, the people who preceded us to the thesis. That to me, that was the strongest thing. I really, really liked that first set of drawings, and maybe it's even an image behind you, because I can't find the debt to, quite frankly, you know, the boys.
You're talking about substance?
I'm talking about the images you made for your routine house.
These ones?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I think that they suggest a departure. You know, you certainly are in conversation with contemporary practitioners, artists. I'm not doubting that. But I think that it's precisely because of when you're making them, because you can do, it's not the line so much, it's the pixel, isn't it, of the photographic manipulation. That I think that this offers an opportunity of, you know, making headway to a new ground. Where, and this is just my own quibble, I think that the kind of the mimetic quality of some of the other drawings, you know, that they repeat maybe stylistic practices, just to me are less, you know, just exciting. I mean this as a compliment. Just in particular, I wanted to note how that your thesis of kind of inhabiting worked for me in this first set in particular.
Okay.
Yeah, you know, I mean, Chloe said it all, and the reason why I was asking about, you know, consciousness relation to geometry is because I also think that, you know, that probably the set of drawings that you created for, you know, the consciousness character are somehow less successful than, you know, the substance and also the spectral. The spectral character is to me somehow crucial, you know, really in order to understand what this spectral can mean and how the notion of spectral can differentiate from what Eisenman would call the virtual or the latent, you know, potential of architecture. And, you know, you are referring somehow to two different bodies of ideas and also two different approaches to architecture that somehow are antithetical, you know, because on the one hand, you were talking about Palasma, about Bachelard, you know, the poetics of space. So you were moving your reflections from a kind of phenomenological approach to architecture. But at the same time, you were mentioning Eisenman, Bernard Choumi, you know, John Hayduck, you know, which were referring to a completely different idea, you know, of somehow autonomy and also of deep structure intrinsic to architecture, which is really anti-phenomenological. So it's interesting, it will be interesting to hear from you what at the end of this journey, you know, the spectral represent to you and how you would eventually overcome this duality between, you know, phenomenology and you know, and grammar or syntax somehow.
You know, that was my initial, like what I was interested in was that clash between phenomenology and something that is not related to the body at all and how we understand things that have nothing to do with our body. So that's where like my thesis started from, and that is why I was interested in the line, because the line kind of brought everything together, because it wasn't about if you're using the space physically or if you're looking or viewing it, you have to it starts with a drawing. And I think that your question's really interesting, because to me, consciousness, which was like geometry, was kind of a link between the two. between the physical and the textual. Well, I started with a different mentality. I started first with thinking that the spectral, so the text quality of drawings was in between the two, but maybe it's the form of translation and the way that we understand it, which is through geometry and not necessarily through the text. The text becomes like a bigger, more umbrella term, which is translated through geometry into the physical, or vice versa from the other side.
You know, and that sounds interesting as a, you know, as an answer, because a very easy, even traditional way to look at it is from a kind of Hegelian, you know, perspective. So that, you know, you have a thesis, you have an antithesis, and then you have a synthesis. And, you know, and the spectral could be the synthesis. But what you just said, yeah, sounds quite intriguing. You know, the spectral as a kind of mediator between these two instances. And yeah, that could be definitely a way to look at it.
I wonder, Parandis, just by way of suggestion, maybe of, you know, the opportunity for you to push this thesis further, but also a way to think is to maybe resist, both in sort of concept, but also the written text itself, those sorts of declarative sentences. I would say that while I was incredibly impressed by the breadth and the depth of a lot of your references, if I would quibble, I would say that sometimes I felt, you know, not only ricocheted, you know, a shuttlecock back and forth between centuries and ideas, but I was also, there were moments, much like this tension that we're talking about, consciousness and geometry, where as a reader, because I felt differently, I was concerned about how kind of steadfast your language was. So I think it kind of, you know, I think that there was a tradition of certainty that has become undone in 20th century thought, certainly. You know, that's what Deleuze and all of the semioticians before him have told us. That's where we are, sort of, it's, the meaning is almost divested. And I suggest to you to be comfortable with that. You know, I know the compulsion to organize is true for all architects. So I totally get that. And the pressure on you in thesis writing to sort of clarify and to maybe have a hierarchy, I totally understand. But because of the level of your thinking, I would also just find comfort in uncertainties too. And I think that that could be perhaps a way, well, actually, here's what I would say about the text. You can do maybe one of, these are suggestions, one of two things. One is that you narrow the focus. So maybe just talk about one or two people, but the other, and I think this is probably more to your sensibility, is to, I think, revel in the things that are not certain and declarative, so that it doesn't, we don't need to be maybe stubborn about this wedding of geometry to consciousness.
Yeah, can I jump in here?
Yeah.
This is, am I on?
Yeah.
You are. We are hearing you.
This has been a conversation, Chloe, that's been with us throughout the process, and I totally am with you on this. You know, first of all, Parandis, like Chloe said, and you know, the drawings are absolutely beautiful. I think this is very successful as a work. If we take it as a text without drawings for a moment, then I have some issues with it. Maybe as an editor, but I think they go beyond editing. And I think the primary thing for me is this question of the declarative. And it's not that it happens once or twice. It's that it's your technique is constantly to declare. And many times when you're making one of these declarations, immediately my mind just goes, no, that's not correct. Okay. And, or maybe that's correct, but there's never any background for us to know if it's correct or not. Right. And at the end, I'm stuck personally in between trying to understand whether I read your text as so brilliant that I can't understand it, or hopelessly naive. Okay, and this is problematic for me. I think it's problematic. You know, just to give you one example, you stated very early on, you said the line comes before architecture, and then you went on to the next thing, right? And you know, that statement itself needs 1,000 pages. Right? That's a huge, gigantic statement to make.
I picked up on that sentence too, Colin, thinking, really? The primitive hut? It was drawn before it was inhabited? These are, yeah.
You know, in my work, which has been dealing with lines and architecture, you know, I would take exactly the opposite position. I would say that line and architecture are absolutely coterminous, right? Or cogenerative. You can't have architecture without line, and as soon as you have line, you have architecture. So they are one and the same thing. But all I'm saying here is that there are different ways of understanding this condition and this situation, and many different ways of understanding it. And, you know, because you ground your work, so to speak, and ground is another one we could talk about, but you ground your work in philosophical reading, then you open up the whole history of philosophy, right? And so we actually expect statements like that to be grounded in that history, in that philosophical understanding. You know, one simple way to do it is to say, you know, in this work, in my opinion, line comes before architecture, right? Then we can say, well, okay, I don't agree with that, but is that an acceptable axiom for this work to follow from? But you don't, right? You simply state it as fact.
I wonder, Parandis, if the statement of fact is also due to the way that much of the Western philosophy up until the 20th century was declarative, that there was more certainty in the effort to just understand an unknowing world. So I think another because I totally agree with Colin's point about inserting yourself into the language, to kind of pick up on the Foucauldian idea of at least contextualizing, you know, saying it's part of the epistemology of the time, it's part of the world order and thinking of its time. And that also makes you a contemporary, so that you're thinking very much about how, though you are indebted or at least acknowledging kind of a longer thread, a long history, that in your current time, your thinking could not possibly be as absolute, because it's a condition that we've just been told that we can't think in black and white.
The reason for that, okay.
This isn't to take away, I think, from the power of this thesis, but rather to suggest that this thesis is by no means done. And it's going to take you another 40 years to finish it, right? Because I think there are so many questions raised by it. You know, you're going to wake up in 15 years and you're going to think back on one of these declarations that you made today, and you're going to go, oh my God, I was completely wrong, right? And that's going to keep happening for your whole life. And I think that's incredibly rich, right? So what we see at the moment, I think, is a kind of embryonic state of the thinking here that needs much more, or that deserves, not needs, that deserves much more thought and consideration at every moment.
Or, Colin, it's possible that Parandis will wake up in 15 years and say, oh my God, I was right about that one.
Yes, that's possible too. That's possible too.
I fully agree with you that there is a lot of work that needs to be done. And it's not in the context of this thesis. I think this is a wonderful beginning, but I think the discussion is certainly pointing out the complexity of the ideas and the kind of, I don't think it's just the necessity of the compactness of a master's thesis. I think that the discussion focusing on the declarative approach of your not just writing, but I think thinking as well is where the work really needs to start to expand. And so I think that those are very fair comments.
Yeah, thank you.
I wanted to just add, Rick, this doesn't take away from the drawings though, because I think it's a compliment to you that we can veer into the text and the language of the text. It's precisely because the drawings are so open-ended, non-declarative, that there's real strength to the work that you've produced. I would hope that that's more of the takeaway.
Yeah, I would, much of what I would have wanted to say has been said, Parandis, and as you know, we have been, talking about some of these, as Colin said, some of these issues throughout the thesis. This is not a particularly rigorous critique I'm about to offer here, but I'm just going to say I could look at your drawings all day long. I can look at your text for about 10 minutes. And so that tells me something. Obviously, you're much more comfortable expressing yourself and exploring these ideas through drawing. And I think, as everyone has already said, the drawings, I think, are far more successful than the writing. Precisely, I think, as Chloe says, because they allow for open-endedness. There's an ambiguity to them and a complexity. And one of the things that I find really interesting about them is that I feel, at the same time, I feel invited to inhabit them, and I'm also pushed away. There's a tension there between the invitation and the kind of hermetic quality that really is there's this game of kind of engaging with them, I think, on multiple levels. The text, I would say, does much more pushing away than inviting. And it basically, I guess it comes down to this kind of declarative position that doesn't allow for discourse, right? It's just sort of, here's how things are. I don't have to explain why things are this way. I don't have to substantiate any of my claims. And therefore, we can't really have a conversation. Whereas the drawings, I think, are much more of that. Like I said, they oscillate for me between invitation and hermeticism, which I think is an interesting place for them to be kind of situated. So yeah, I mean, I guess, I don't have a lot more to add than what's already been said, but I do find the text problematic for these reasons. I think that given the intensity and even just the sheer volume of drawing, you could do with a lot less text, a lot less and much more precise. Because in addition to the declarative quality, the text also has, to me, a kind of stream of consciousness quality. It's very hard to get a hold of anything because you go, as Chloe mentioned, you kind of ricochet, the reader ricochets around. Like it's difficult to get a thread that really, and hang on to it and ride it for any kind of distance, right? So one exercise that might be really helpful would be to write as little as possible and still convey those key points that you need to convey, and let the drawings do, which they are already doing, let them do the bulk of the work. So one of the things I think is, partly for me, it's also the way the document is organized. There's a lot of text at the front end before we get to the drawings. And by the time we get to the drawings, I'm really confused by the text, right? So there may be a way of kind of distributing the material differently that might also take away some of this some of this discomfort that we seem to have with the text.
Can I just add about the writing skills and about text? I would just like to recommend to maybe rethink or to take a look at some other probably bibliographic references when talking about drawing, thought, and text as well. In your description of what drawing and the drawn line means to you, I think you probably need to elaborate a bit more on Leon Battista Alberti's idea of disegno, as a combination of drawing and design, which is a very Renaissance idea, but I think at least you have to mention it, and to define it. I really think you can't escape from it. When you are talking about, and there's a very nice book by Mario Carpo called The Alphabet and the Algorithm, which probably you can, just check it out to better understand this relationship between, drawing and language. When talking about text, it's clear that, Peter Eisman is one of your main references. Peter Eisman encounter with Derrida, I think dates back to the 80s. They also worked together. I think you could also refer to Peter Eisman's interest in Noam Chomsky, which was one of his references when Eisman was working on his house series, so between 1969 to 1978. So in that specific moment when he was working on his cardboard architectures, Chomsky, was one of his main sources of inspirations. And probably again, in the text, you could reference and to expand a bit more on that relationship and how that relationship inspired Eisman and his own approach on cardboard architecture. And last thing, when you were talking about material and substance, and material in terms of physical presence and so on, I would recommend to take a look at, probably you're familiar with it, but I would recommend to take a look at the Atlas of Novel Tectonics by Reiser and Umemoto, where they somehow replace this idea of materials and materiality with a distinction between intensive and extensive properties, which again, following up on what Chloe was saying, is somehow a contemporary or more recent way to look at, at physical properties somehow.
Yeah. I think those are all good references, and they continue to they add to the contextualization that has been discussed. So I think those are great suggestions.
Does anybody have anything they'd like to add? We're coming up close to an hour, and we will want to convene the committee shortly. I just wonder whether there's any concluding statements from any of our guests or committee members or Parandis.
Well, I'd like to say that it was certainly a challenge working with Parandis this year, coming to understand exactly what Parandis was interested in took a while, but I really appreciate the inquiry into very fundamental aspects of architecture. And as was stated, I think that this is the start point of a long process of inquiry. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you all very much. It sounds like we've come to the end of our discussion. So Parandis, again, thank you for your presentation. We'll invite you now to please leave the meeting. We're going to have a brief discussion about the work, and then John has another presentation right after this, so he may not be able to get right back to you, but you'll hear back from him shortly.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much for
Thank you, Parandis.
Yeah, congratulations. Great job.
Thank you. Thank you.